There is actually a lot happening. It just feels like almost everything has been washed out due to tariffs in the past like week or so. While there's like
Right.
massive news happening in basically every corner of the globe. But obviously, the U.S. and Russia continue to have these sort of off and on negotiations. Ukraine continues to do whatever Ukraine is doing. European countries, of course, massively rearming. So a lot happening vis-a-vis Ukraine that has big ripple effects around the world, potentially quite dangerous ones. So we are very, very honored to be joined here once again on the show by Mazda Majidi, who is a political analyst and organizer with the Answer Coalition. Mazda, thanks so much for being back with us.
Hi, Eugene. Thanks. It's great to be here.
Great to have you with us. And I guess, sort of maybe speaking a little bit to my intro here, I was hoping we could start with a little bit of an update on where things are in the war. Because, of course, just before all the negotiations with Trump started, the media was filled with like Russia's winning. But now that the negotiations are happening, I feel like the actual status of what's happening on the ground has kind of fallen out of the stories. And it's all just about people, meeting in this or that place.
You're right, Eugene. I think with any negotiations, you really have to use as your starting point an observation of what's happening on the battlefield. Overall, and this is important, something like 20%, one-fifth of the area of Ukraine is now under Russian control. Just a couple of days ago, Newsweek published this article heavily emphasizing the fact that Russia's advances have slowed down. And they had numbers. They were saying in November 2024, Russia took 700 square kilometers. In December, it went down to 400. And elsewhere, the British Foreign Ministry published a number saying that in March of 25, Russia had taken over only 143 square kilometers. Now, that may well be true in terms of slowing down, but the fact remains that uh, Russia continues to make advances, and that's a significant point when we're dealing with the approach that Zelensky and the Ukrainian ruling class is taking with regards to this. Another point that's important to people who were following the news is in August of 24, Ukraine, uh, went into the Kursk region in Russia, which was a surprise attack, and it militarily didn't make any sense to anybody. And Kursk, of course, is a region that's known to those people who are familiar with the history of the Eastern Front in World War II. That's the scene of the greatest tank battle in history where the Red Army defeated the Nazis. But that incursion into Russian soil, which was pretty deep, was eventually pushed back, which could also explain why Russian advances elsewhere haven't been as much as before. But one of the things that even Zelensky pointed out is that Russia is planning for a spring offensive in the Kharkiv region and Sunni regions. Excuse me. So overall, as we're looking at the negotiations and the possibilities for agreements and understandings, we have to keep in mind that things are not going well for Ukraine. And the fact, and this has been an ongoing problem, it's becoming harder and harder for Ukraine to keep soldiers on the front. A lot of young people who are called up refuse to go. Some leave the battlefront for lack of any support. A lot of them are losing many of their comrades and so forth. So on the battlefront, things are not going well, and it is likely that with the spring offensive, things will get even worse for Ukraine.
I'm curious if you could tell us, Mazda, with these US Russia peace talks stalled and European nations, as Eugene mentioned in the beginning, rearming, they're also considering troop deployments, increased military aid. What's driving this divide between the US and Europe, and why is the US advocating for peace now while Europe appears to be the one favoring escalation, which is sort of like backwards in how it started? Or perhaps that's not the correct framing.
No, Ronnie, I think that is currently the framing that reflects the reality on the ground. I mean, one of the things that we have to keep in mind, despite this image that the European imperialists have like to present of themselves of being, cultured and civilized and all this kind of stuff, they're, just as much imperialist as the US. In some instances, at least in the last 70, 80 years, they've been less adventurous than the US. But when it comes to the rush to take over a territory and take over an area's resources and markets, they're just as aggressive as the US. And the whole issue of Ukraine and Russia, as little as this is covered in the Western media, and particularly in the corporate media in the US, Russia has legitimate concerns, and the concern is that the European imperialists, the French, the Germans, the British, may not just want to bring Ukraine into their orbit, but Russia itself, which offers them vast resources and so forth. No, the Europeans would very much like to end the days of Putin and bring back elements like Boris Yeltsin, who put a for sale sign on everything. And, this is something with the continued eastward expansion of NATO that is very concerning. And the other thing that's almost never covered in the US media is essentially the coup that overthrew the Ukrainian president in 2012, and led to different developments that that it's happening now, and Zelensky and so forth. There were agreements, Minsk One and Minsk Two, that had to do with the eastern region of Ukraine, where the majority of the population is Russian, and there was Ukraine had committed to, prior to Zelensky's time, had committed to observing an autonomy, limited autonomy for those regions, and Ukraine has reneged on that for the last 7, 8 years and so forth. So, from the European perspective, the perspective of European imperialists, they would very much like to completely integrate Ukraine into their orbit if they haven't already, and if they can impose a humiliating defeat on Russia, then there's a good chance that they can overthrow or sideline Putin and his grouping in the Russian leadership, and the prize would be Russia and all of its vast land and resources. For the US, it's different. I mean, much of the US ruling class still wants to support Zelensky, but of course, the Trump grouping now wants to limit that. And that's a whole different discussion as far as what Trump's motivations are and so forth. But I'll just say this: if you look at the dismantling of Yugoslavia by the imperialists, led by the US, but also the British, the French, the Germans, and so forth, most of the gains of those went to the European banks and corporations. So again, European imperialist states are no humanitarian entities.
Yeah, no, great point, and I think an important one, given, as you say, the way they try to make themselves appear, especially vis-a-vis Donald Trump now, who's so rude, crude, and boorish. It's easy for anyone to shade themselves in a positive direction. But I wanted to speak to the point you just made about Donald Trump's motivations, because, of course, this is one of the main things that's held out by his supporters and himself about how he's all for peace. I mean, amazingly, they even said this morning they're all for peace with China, which, okay, fine. But, peace, peace, peace. But Ukraine is the centerpiece of that because it's so different than what we had seen from the bipartisan consensus, since the invasion of Ukraine. So, I mean, maybe it's obvious here, but is he a peace president? Is this a sign that he loves peace, or is there something else going on here?
Well, Trump is different from as we all know, different from the typical ruling class politician. Most ruling class politicians are essentially trained through a long period of the different interests of various banks and corporations and so forth. Trump is in part motivated by his personal ego and his petty battles with this or that. So the starting point with Ukraine and how he diverged from the majority of the US ruling establishment is how, in the lead up to the 2024 elections, he called Zelensky and asked him to dig up dirt on Hunter Biden, who had business dealings. there. But also, I think we have to look at another component of that, and that is that from the imperialist perspective, much of the ultra aggressive approach towards Russia is not all that rational. Now, granted that generally speaking, imperialist policies are determined by their strategic interest and so forth. But when it came to the Cold War, the opposition of the US and the European imperialists to the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc was obvious. The motivation was, socialism is a dangerous thing to capitalism, and you have to use every method to try to overthrow socialism. When it comes to Russia, I think much of the reason why Russia is, in many instances, on the polar opposite side of the Europeans and the US is how they've pushed Russia to that corner, and how instead of accepting Russia into the European Union, they just wanted Russia to be their source of raw materials. They wanted to convert Russia to a completely third world oppressed country, and that didn't work. Now, it is true that I think Trump and some of the people in his administration, and this goes beyond Trump, there's been this view among uh, imperialist ideologues that the opposition to this level to Russia doesn't even make sense. And there's a lot of resources, lots and lots of resources that the US and the Europeans have poured into this war that Ukraine is fighting against Russia, that from their perspective should be mostly directed towards the more important battle with China, which is socialist and which is very much a rising superpower. And from the imperialist perspective, a much more serious threat to their interests than Russia is.
Mazda, I'm curious if I could bring in one more thing here since we're talking about negotiations and war and peace. Um, as I'm sure you're following, there are these negotiations that will be taking place with Iran on Sunday, indirectly through the Omanis. And Trump has been talking about potential war if Iran doesn't capitulate, but also that he really, really wants to make a deal. He just met with Netanyahu, which was a bizarre sort of uh, press conference that included some Iran talk. And, Netanyahu, we know, is really, really would love for the U.S. to just destroy Iran and regime change it. But there do seem to be a few contradictions there. So obviously, we'll know more after Sunday. But I'm just curious your general thoughts, as it seems like we are closer than before to a potential war with Iran, and we also have a very different region we're dealing with now, where what was known as the resistance axis is significantly weaker than it was a year ago, 2 years ago.
Well, Rania, I think, um, we kind of have to emphasize that the reality of negotiations with Iran is likely not to produce any agreements. Um, with any negotiations, you have to look at not the diplomatic skills of the individual politicians involved and so forth, but what each side is willing or able to give as concessions. And while since Trump went into office, uh, at least in Iran and for much of the US media, they've been talk about negotiations and deals and so forth. I haven't seen anything from either side that indicates that any agreement is possible. The Trump administration wants essentially Iran to capitulate on all fronts. End your nuclear program and any support for Hamas, for Hezbollah, for resistance, for Yemen, for resistance to Zionism and imperialism in the region, and then we'll talk. And of course, the Islamic Republic of Iran, uh, to its very core, has existed to in support of this region, despite its many, many internal contradictions and so forth. It is not a possibility for Iran to give up on all of those things. At the same time, that I don't think uh, a real peace is possible despite all the media attention it's getting. I don't think an escalation of war is possible either. I mean, Trump is doing his normal thing of talking big and hoping to intimidate the opposing side into capitulating. But in this case, that's not going to happen. But the reality is that for the same reason, even much more so than the last 20 plus years, as much as the US would like to overthrow Iran, there's no possibility for it to do that without paying, a heavy, heavy expense in terms of the retaliation that Iran can put out, not just against Israel, but for the US bases and the US client states in the region. Iran is not 2003 Iraq. Iran has a lot of capabilities to defend itself, and the tens of thousands of missiles and rockets that it has in buried deep in the ground that people may have seen the clips of indicates that it's not going to be an easy thing. So Trump can talk big and hope that an agreement can be reached, but in that sense, it's similar to what Trump has done with the Ukraine, thinking that if he just started talking big, people would be forced to make an agreement, and still the contradictions that underlie that battle and the contradictions that underlie the confrontation between the US and Iran are still in existence, and that's not something that can be talked away. So I would say I'm not too hopeful in any meaningful agreement, and I'm not too fearful under the current circumstances of a US bombing of Iran.
Mm-hmm. Well, from Eastern Europe to West Asia, this is why we always like to invite you on. Mazda Majidi, thank you so much. You're an organizer with the Answer Coalition. Really appreciate you joining us and helping us sort through it all.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.